Hey everyone, what is up? Welcome to this episode of My Coding School. In today's video, we're going to go over the Apple login method with Expo and Firebase and getting it all connected. So when we come to our application right now, we had the original email password that we did in a previous video and we're signing in. What we see now is this sign in with Apple button, which is pretty cool because I did not style this. It comes out of the package with the Apple logo, sign with Apple. Obviously, Apple's very specific on how all of their UI elements look, and so if we add certain libraries, we can get this to show up correctly if we do everything correctly. But there's some configuration that has to be done, and depending on what application you have, whether it's just Expo with EAS build or the React Native application, I'm going to go over a little bit of both because actually in TrackFi, I use the regular, the native React Native build version, and then in this example, we're going to use EAS, which I'll show you the differences between the file structures as we go through it. So let's get into the code. First, we can see we have this sign-in method, a sign-in with Apple. I'm not going to be able to show the sign-in completely in this video just yet because it is a little bit more difficult to sign in on the emulator itself. It says you can, but let's be honest, it is difficult. And you'd even see, like, if you try the Android device and Android emulator, obviously you can't use sign with Apple because it's not an Apple device. You can't do it on web either. The easiest one to do to test this out is on the iOS device with the QR code that I mentioned before. So when you do npm run iOS, it'll give you that QR code, and you can go to the Apple Store on your phone and your device and download the Expo Go app. And with that Expo Go app, you'll be able to scan the QR code and it'll pull it up on your device yourself. So it'll run the code. And I've mentioned that a few times. I just think it's super helpful. And then it does say iOS simulator, but it's a little bit more complicated that way. So first thing we're going to do is the documentation for Expo is pretty good. You have to read it. When I first did it, I had to read it a few different times because there is a couple different configurations here. No matter what, though, the first thing we're going to do is install Expo Apple authentication. So this is using npx expo install. You could also do yarn install if you're using yarn, and you could do npm install if you're using npm. Obviously, once we do that, it's going to show up into this dependency. So right now, I already installed it. We're using npm, so I did npm I or npm install expo-apple-authentication, and the latest version is 5.0.1. And so once we have that installed, we're going to import that into our login file. So we have import star, so it's saying import this entire library as Apple authentication. So this is declaring the variable that we're going to be able to use from Expo Apple authentication. And once we get this up and running, we're actually going to connect it with Firebase too. So we imported a couple other modules for Firebase auth, for auth provider, and sign with credential, but we'll get to that in a second. So next step we do, if we go to the documentation itself, we can see we have two different ways to configure this. Actually, three ways. Configuration in app.json or configuration.app.config.js. We're not using app.config.js. We are using app.json. Or if you're doing the bare React Native app, you could actually copy and paste this right here and put it in the right file. So you can see this actually, if you were to run the React Native bare, it creates different folders. And so here, I'll just go over the differences between Expo and bare React Native. When you create those folders for Expo, we just have this Expo folder, and then we have assets and the node modules. We don't have any folders for iOS and Android. And the way those two are handled is through this app.json file. So we could do different configurations within Expo for iOS and Android through here. And what happens is when you run Expo, it'll build files based on this app.json and take certain things that we're importing. So right here, by default, I didn't add any of this. This is when you do Expo build. We have support tablet true, and then Android has a little bit different adaptive icon, foreground image, and background color. We have this web favicon. So these are 3 different configurations for Expo when it gets built and compiled to iOS, when it gets compiled to Android, when it gets compiled to web. The only one that we're going to add actually is this plugin. So plugins, Expo Apple authentication. And this is so that when Expo builds it, knows to bring in the modules, the iOS modules for this Expo Apple authentication, because there's a lot of configuration that has to be done to get this to work. And then back to this Expo app. This is our example app, but I'll go back to the TrackFi example that I have, and let's close up some of this. We have this Expo folder like we do in the other one, but we also have this iOS folder. And that's because I ran iOS natively on the device, and this is a bare React native app. And once we run this, this is the same folder that we get if we were to do regular Swift development, Objective-C development. We have this folder for the build, pods, TrackFi, and if we go to this TrackFi entitlements, we could actually see that we have the same keys. com.apple.developer.apple signin, array defaults. Let's see if it matches right here. com.apple.developer.signin, string key default. And so in our application, we don't have to do this manually. I do like the fact that you just copy and paste it in here, and then once you rebuild, it automatically happens. Versus here, this Expo Apple authentication, it's like, okay, well, because you're using Expo authentication, once we compile the app to iOS, it'll automatically add these files for iOS and then the TrackFi or whatever that your app name is called, that entitlements, and it'll add those keys so that the Apple device knows to use sign in with Apple. So, a little different, but the end result will be the same depending on which method you go with. So if once we add this plugins, Expo Apple authentication, we do have to do one more thing, and we're going to do npx expo run iOS. So when you're running bare React Native, it'll automatically have that file in their .entitlements, and it'll have everything configured already. But for Expo, you have to tell it to configure those things. So the way we're going to do that is this command npx expo run iOS. After we have this plugins line in, that's the key part here. After we have this plugins line, it's like, okay, well, then there's Expo. This is where Expo comes in handy. It'll go through the prompts to set it up for you. I'm not going to actually set it up right here because I don't want to set up a whole new account for this test app, but I did do it for TrackFi. And so it'll ask you the identifiers for the bundle identifier, which is in iOS itself. So once you run npx expo run iOS, it has right there. So once you go through that, it'll build the folder and the iOS with the right entitlements, and so that when you click on sign in with Apple, it will actually be able to sign in with that Apple ID. Now that the base configuration is there, I'm going to assume the base configuration is there. There is still some work to be done in our login method. So this part's a little bit more straightforward. How do we actually trigger this to show? So if we were to delete this line right here and actually run, npm run iOS. Let's reload our application so we're up to date. Okay, this is what we had before this, where once we import this library, Apple Authentication, we could use this component, Apple Authentication .Apple Authentication button. And if we go back to the documentation, there's an example of this. So we have Apple Authentication button, and these are defaults. So you could do button type sign in, and then this is just importing the styles and the text from this component. So everything's predefined. You can change this if you want, but I would just go with the defaults so that it looks like every other Apple login button there is out there. Corner radius 5 styles.button. We have corner radius 5 and style instead of styles.button, which is defined in this file somewhere. We're just defining it manually with 200 and a height of 44. And so you can customize this as much as you want, but the main thing here is the actual component which loads the button itself. Once we have the button, we want to call the method login with Apple. We can name this whatever we want. We named it login with Apple here. This is a method that we created up here, and where the magic happens is this Apple authentication.signin async. And so we have access to this signin async method with Apple authentication when we import it from expo-apple-authentication. And in that, we have these requested scopes, and that's what it takes in of full name and email. And so this is the functionality that's actually contacting Apple. So right now, this is just signing with Apple. Like, okay, we have our Apple ID, if you're doing on your device, hooks up with Apple. Apple's like, okay, this person actually exists or they don't exist with them. And that's the first step in the process. Let's say everything works perfectly. I am a user with Apple. I get a token response. We could see line 29 is the identity token saying like, okay, this person exists with Apple. Here's some of their information. The next step we want to do is actually hook it up with our Firebase account so that when they log in with a email password, it just doesn't get lost in the abyss of Apple. We want to store that information ourselves as well. And if we were to go back to the TrackFi example, we could see we have this sign-in method. Let's go back to my coding school. We're going to add a new provider, click Apple, and we're going to click Enable. The next step we have to do here, you have to be able to go into your Apple account and create an ID to put into here, and then click Save. But we're gonna assume that's there because the real chunk of the meat right here is this identity token. This is the part that was a little confusing at first, to me at least. So we have this identity token. What the heck do we do with this token? This is just a UUID from Apple. Not super clear what to do with that. So to hook up to Firebase, we need to import an OAuth provider. So an OAuth provider is any one of these methods right here: Google, Facebook, Play Games, GitHub, Apple Game Center, Twitter, etc. These are all OAuth providers. We're going to import apple.com, and this is how we structure it. And we're going to add the scope of email because we have email up here, and the scope of name because we have name up here. And that means once we actually do sign in, we get those values as returned. Next step, credential. We have this, we defined the Apple provider within Firebase, and now we have to pass in that token that we got from Apple to create said credential. So we're going to construct this object of credential, merging the Apple and Firebase environments, and then we're going to try and sign in with that. So just like we defined up here, we imported create user with email and password from Firebase. We also have sign in with credential with Firebase. We're not creating a user because we're signing in. So we're going to sign in with credential. We're going to pass in the same auth object that we created for create with email and password. And the only difference is instead of email and password, we're going to pass in this credential that we've defined, this ID token from Apple. And as a response, we'll get the same user up here. So we'll still get a user, a UID, and it'll be the same structure. Whether they log in with email and password or they log in with Apple, it'll get the same response from Firebase so that you could do with the UID from Firebase with what you want. And that's how you define like a lot of the fields. So let's say we had a lot of transactions from this user. You want to store it under that user object. Usually track it with a UID in your database, but we'll come to that a little bit later on. But yeah, that is the Apple login method. The big part here is not just logging in with Apple, but then also getting that credential and creating a new user within our Firebase system so that we can manage both email and password users, with Apple users, with Google users, all in the same place. And that allows us to easily track them. And then you could also, it's pretty cool, you could also do any other custom providers within Firebase. So hope that was helpful. In the next couple episodes, of course, we'll build on this as we go on, but this is the basic setup for our login pages for any type of application you want to use within Firebase.